Hello and welcome to the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Our guest today is Lisa Braxton. She is an author and the author of the book, The Talking Drum. An interesting title, Lisa. Welcome.
Well, Stephanie, thank you for having me.
Lisa, where did that title come from, The Talking Drum? That brings to mind a lot of images when you think of a talking drum.
I felt that that title would draw a lot of attention, and people would look at that title, and people who know African culture would definitely say, "I can connect with that title." The title comes from the talking drum. There are two talking drums in my novel. One is the bookstore that one of my main characters, Malachi, decides to open with his wife, Sydney, supporting him. And he's harking back to the days of the in African villages where people use the talking drum to let people know that we're villagers, we're walking around to another village, and we come with peace. We want to celebrate births, christenings, all kinds of rites of passage to let you know about what's going on. And he felt my main character wanted to make the bookstore a talking drum, which people would come together and talk about the politics, the discourse of the day, also to read poetry, have intellectual conversations. I do have a character in my novel who actually uses a talking drum. He's a drummer from Africa. He's come to the US for college, and he takes the drum and the talking drum, and he actually uses a mallet and squeezes it, and that makes the drum sound like it's talking. He's a friend of one of my other main characters. So I wanted to use the African culture in my book. I don't think you see that very often in stories, and I thought it'd be interesting to show how the drum is used for communication.
Now, this takes place, or the book takes place in a fictional town called Bellport, and it's in New England. Why did you choose that area of the country to focus on? What impacted you to, or what caused you to want to use that part of the country?
Well, I grew up in New England. I'm from Connecticut originally. I currently live in the Boston area. And I've seen where gentrification has really affected a lot of the cities along the eastern seaboard. Back when my parents moved to Connecticut, back during the 50s, Bridgeport, Connecticut, my hometown, it was a booming area, a lot of factories, waterfront area that was nice. But then the factories left, poverty came in, drugs came in. We've seen that quite a bit in a lot of the urban areas along the coast. And as a result, sometimes there are the mayors and other leaders who decide they want to do something about this to clean things up. And that has its good and bad parts because then there's urban redevelopment, which was really big during the 70s. A lot of money came in to different communities, and they would plow over neighborhoods, take them over, and put civic centers and marinas and upscale art galleries. And I see that happening in my hometown right now, in the area where my parents lived when they first moved to Bridgeport, that area where in the 50s there were only certain neighborhoods where Black people were allowed to even to rent. That's been plowed over for all this upscale stuff, which is going to help the town, but it also hurts the sense of community that people have when they're coming from someplace else. And I wanted to capture that in the book. And I wanted to show, I have not seen before the human aspect of what it's like when you have your neighborhood taken from you. There are a lot of newspaper articles that talk about the plans that the city is going to have, what they're going to do, how it's going to improve things. And there are people who protest about that. But how does it really feel for a human being to be part of the fabric of a neighborhood and to lose that? There are some people who, when they have to move, they die. They can't accept that. And oftentimes, back in the era that I was writing about, there weren't the benefits. People went ahead and plowed over, and then the people who were moved, they had nowhere to go because they couldn't go anywhere just where they wanted to because of discrimination, and there was no money set aside to move them or to find them other apartments. So those are the elements I wanted to capture because, as many people say, wise people say that the past is never past. It's not. It keeps happening over and over again, and we see that in Boston and other areas where people are displaced. Sometimes they can be compensated nowadays, but sometimes they're not. And I wanted to capture that human element. What happens to those people?
What's interesting enough, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you as well, that is the story of my husband's family. They moved to the St. Louis area, and with the gentrification, they were moved out of their community of Kenlock. And like you said, some people left and were compensated and did well, other people didn't. Other people, it destroyed their entire lives, having to make this big move. And it's like you haven't heard enough about that. And also, another thing is the book takes place in 1971. And I see it today. Here we are 50 years later, and this is still happening. And like you said, there are some positive aspects of it, but there's also some negative aspects as well.
Yeah, it was interesting how this is somewhat related. When I was in high school, I was a French exchange student, and our teacher took us there. Our actual French teacher escorted us. And she was saying how in France the buildings are so old because they maintained the old. In Europe, you can see the buildings that were built in the 1500s, and they're still there, and you still have that culture and flavor there. But in the U.S., they just plow over things. And as a 16-year-old, I didn't really understand all of that, but now I do. And it's interesting that when I was telling people about the book before it came out, almost everyone I spoke to about it said, that happened to me, or that happened to my neighborhood. And if you look at, for instance, Newton, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston during the 70s, I mention this because there's a church that I go to, that mostly African American Baptist church, and the highway, the extension of the Massachusetts Pike, was cut through the black neighborhood. They called it the village, the black neighborhood. And when people at my church were talking about what happened to them when I mentioned my book idea, they started crying about what happened to them in the late 1960s, because in Newton at that time, if you were black, there was one neighborhood you could move to. And they all lived in that little cluster of streets, and they called it the village. They would play, the kids would play out in the street and whatever. And then the church was right there, that church, that I still go to. But 50 years later, they're like crying about they couldn't move together. People had to scatter. One man who he passed away 2 years ago, a deacon at the church, he was a school principal, and he got on the phone and he called 100 places to find another place to move his family, and finally he got someone there to let him purchase a house. He had to call 100 different places trying to find a home because of discrimination. But most people didn't have the wherewithal to do that, so they scattered to different towns, and that fabric is lost, and it's unfortunate.
How do you think you captured that feeling, the feeling of the times and the feeling of African Americans being displaced? How do you feel? How did you capture that? Here we are 50 years later. What was your method of researching to really get the feel for the time, the area, and the people?
Well, one thing is, of course, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and mom and dad had a clothing store in the urban area. So I was able to capture that from some of my background, just from being a child growing up and helping my parents at the store. So I saw that. And also, I had to do a lot of research because, of course, even though I was alive during the 60s, I was not absorbing it the same way as an adult would. So I did a lot of research to remind me of how people dressed and the different expressions they would use when they were talking. And I would go online and look at videos and movies from that era to remind me of that. And I think that as an author, the best way to capture the flavor of anything is to use the people, the characters in your book. So I set things up so that I wanted you to, for instance, I have a character Kwame who's like a love-hate. He's a slickster, he's smooth, and he's charming, he's good looking. But can you trust him? I don't know. But at the same time, you love to read about him. And also Omar, the drummer, who's so handsome, he's so well built, and he's also very attractive. And then you have the two people who are hoping to do something in the neighborhood that's good. You have Sydney, and you have who's supporting her husband, even though she leaves law school to support him. And then there's Malachi, who has his dream. He wanted to be a full professor at the university, but he was denied tenure. He feels it was because of racism. He has a dream, and so you're hoping that these characters will fulfill their dream. Each character is striving towards something. And as my readers, I hope, are invested in my characters, then you weave in the story about the urban redevelopment and the plans. And if you've read the book, you see there's a fire that happens because that's what happened in those days. I mean, it happens now, but it may not be as easy to do that, to burn down your property, get the insurance money before the city comes in to do the urban redevelopment, because you'll make more money with the insurance money than you would with what the city will compensate you for. So once my reader is invested in these characters, they get to know them, what they look like, their dreams, what they want to achieve, and I take them on the journey of these characters through the book and weave in the gentrification pros and cons and the urban redevelopment.
You know, when you're writing, your characters can become like your children. They mean a lot to you, and you become, as you said, invested in the characters. Do you have a favorite character?
I like all my characters, but for me, my favorite is Omar because he is a sweet man who loves his wife, but his marriage is falling apart, and he has dreams. He wants to be the drumming ambassador of the world. And I can relate to that because I know what it's like to have a dream and really want to fulfill that dream, but obstacles get in the way. Or he's, I think he's a sweet character because he loves his wife, but he just doesn't know how to love her. I enjoy drawing him because I like that he's, I think I mentioned he's the complexion of Sidney Poitier. He's very attractive, very muscular. And I went and I took drumming lessons to learn how to drum because I want to be able to write what it's like to drum, what it's like to teach drumming. So I was very invested in learning to drum, and I would say that for those reasons that Omar is my favorite.
And what did you get out of learning to drum? How did that teach you?
Learning to drum was very interesting because I didn't know this, but there are a lot of drumming circles in Massachusetts. They're probably all over the country too. So I took lessons at the Adult Education Center for a while, and I would go to drumming circles. And when the Boston Marathon, or when they had the Fourth of July fireworks, the Boston Pops, these drummers, they all come together with their drums and they do the African drumming. And interestingly enough, I'm the only black person who shows up. I'm thinking, we're
Wow.
doing African drumming and everybody's white. What is this about? And it just seems, I don't know why that is, but it seems like it's a big draw for white people. But at least in Massachusetts, I never saw a black person who would go out for the drumming. Another thing I learned, that I was very naive and a little bit arrogant about my thoughts about drumming. I said, well, how hard can it be to drum? I mean, you're just going pat, pat, pat. I mean, there are a lot of intricate steps that you do when you're drumming. And I couldn't. I went to a master drumming circle where he was instructing a master class. This drummer from somewhere in West Africa, and he was teaching at a university. So he came into the town in the Grand City Hall chambers. All like about 50 of us were sitting around a circle with our drums, and he would give a pattern. This, and we would all try to copy it. He would walk around the room and nod at the ones who were doing it very well. He kept stopping at me, and he kept saying, "Everybody else," just to make them be quiet and watch me do it over. And I finally said to him after the third time, I said, "I'm not a drummer. I'm just here to learn to drum to write my novel." And he's like, "Oh, okay." But it was not easy at all. And people who are into drumming, they're really serious about it, because I had people sitting near me who were saying, "Well, people who aren't serious about drumming, they should just go home." And I was like, feeling intimidated about that. These are people who they are hardcore. So there's a lot that I learned about drumming through that.
What did you learn about the complexities of relationships? And especially back in that day, you could barely see black people on TV or pictured in films where black people showed emotion toward each other, where there were black relationships, black love. So how did you capture that?
Well, one thing I capture is not black love, but we see this today too, how black people from the African diaspora are so it's just they're just not a unified group, even though in the 70s it looked like we were all, Black power and we're all together and brother and sister. When you look at the different ethnic groups, let's say that come from either the Caribbean or Africa or the US, US, the from the ancestors were the Africans who were enslaved, you see that there are these divisions among us, like who there's some people are looking down at the other people, and I wanted to capture that because I see that today. Black love, I think I expressed that with the love between Sydney and Malachi, where she sacrificed her law career. She was in law school. She wanted to support his dream. At the end of the well, I don't want to say at the end of the book, I'll say it anyway. At the end of the book, it turns around where he is supporting her, which is good. So I think in that respect. And then also when Elmar's marriage is not going very well, he forms a friendship with another character, but it maintains it is pretty much a chaste relationship because she's living with someone, and they had a loving relationship that was platonic, but you saw the love there.
And you know what you're talking about as far as communities not supporting one another. We used to hear a lot of that saying about crabs in a barrel. Once one crab is trying to get up, the other's always pulling the people down. And do you think that that's as relevant today as it was back then?
Oh, I mean, that is definitely relevant today as it was back then. It was funny. I had a conversation with my husband the other day about how there's some relatives, let's say on his side of the family and mine, that they grew up in very small communities, and anyone who wants to be different, if you want to go to a different church than everyone else goes to, or you want to go up north as opposed to staying in the south, and then you're looked at as, oh, you think you're big shot because you're under the big lights of the north, or those kinds of things. And it was funny because we're going to some graduations this summer, for relatives and this and that, and we're like bracing ourselves because those things still happen. I mean, even they were happening back in the 50s and back then, but it's still the same way. You still see that crabs in the barrel. But I think that in my generation, you get the crabs in the barrel mentality. You see it around you. But I would say, Stephanie, I would believe that you and I are individuals who will not let that stop us, because we women are not letting anything stop us these days. That's my opinion. The crabs in the barrel, they're there, but I climb away from that barrel and I keep going.
But speaking of keeping going, what gave you, this is your first novel, what gave you that to feel like I can do this? I can come up with this story, I can put it in writing, and I can sell it. What gave you that for people who, like me, who want to write that book but just haven't put it all together yet? What would you tell us?
Um, Well, I think that for me, my motivation goes back to my childhood because I was a bookworm, and I would say to my mother when she would say, "Lisa, go out and play. It's nice to get some fresh air." No, I want to read my Nancy Drew mystery, Mommy. I'm going to stay in. And I would say to her, "Mommy, one day when I grow up, I'm going to write a novel." And she'd say, "Well, that's nice, Lisa, but you can't earn a living writing novels." And I took that to mean that, well, when I got older, I went to college in Hampton, as you did, for journalism, for mass media. And I kept going from there. And I was determined after my media career concluded, I was determined to write this novel. I told mommy that back when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, I was going to write this novel. And I wanted mom and dad to see it while they were still here. And thank the Lord they did. That helped to motivate me. In fact, my book came out in 2020. My mother was ill with cancer, and in May 2020, Mother's Day, we were still afraid to even be around people because of COVID. So I got my copies of my book. I got my copies a few weeks prior to that. So I surprised her, and I drove down, and my mother came to the door. She'd gone through chemo, so she had, scarf on her head, beautiful scarf that I actually gave her, as I remember, scarf on her head. And she's like, "Come in." No, 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 I'm not going to come in. I'm afraid that if I'm a carrier, although I'm not sick, I'm a carrier, you'll get it from me. I don't want you to get sicker. So what I did was I dedicated my book to, for my parents. I can't see it here, but for my parents. And I took the book through the door, the screen door, and I smashed up against the door so mommy could see for my parents. My father was upstairs at the house. When he was upstairs, he walks downstairs on his cane, and he had Parkinson's. He was hobbling down the stairs on his cane, and he looks at the book. He had the biggest smile on his face I've ever seen, the biggest smile. And they were just so proud of me. And I said, yes, I fulfilled my dream. I talked to mommy about this when I was 6 or 7. I wanted to write this book. I wanted to be a writer. And I'm just so blessed that they lived long enough to see it. A few
Now
months after
that you
that,
have
mommy
your
passed away. My father passed away in September. But before that, we put him in assisted living. And one day on Skype, he says to me, I read your, I gave him a copy. I read your book, Lisa, up to page 36. And I said, well, thank you, Daddy, because I'm thinking, okay, he has Parkinson's, he has dementia. The aide probably read it to him. But the fact that he read to page 36 shows that he's so proud. And that made me just so happy. So sometimes the motivation for writing a book or whatever you're trying to do comes from those people, family, friends, business partners who push you along. They're the wind beneath your wings, basically. And I would say that's what really helped to motivate me to. It was like a 10-year project, but that's what motivated me to keep going, to tear it up, revise. I had so many rejections from so many publishers and also literary agents.
how do you
Some
deal
said,
with
"Oh, it's
that?
boring. Why'd you start with that car ride?" And I was like, "I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop until I get this book written and published." And that's the way I approached it.
But how did you deal with that? Like you said, you had so many rejections. How did you deal with those rejections and keep it moving?
I think when you're a writer, it's important to be in a writing community. And I had a writing group. 4 or 5 of us would come to Barnes and Noble every other week, reading our pages. And I was saying to them, I've been rejected by so and so agent. And then one person would say, but I like what you've written here. Just keep working on it. I think it's very good. And don't give up on it. I was in a book club with my church, and I had them read the manuscript. We would read a book every month, but this particular month they read my manuscript and they tore it up, and they told me what was good, what was not working. Having a support system, that's what helped to keep me going too.
So, where are you going from here?
I'm going to take a nap. I'm just kidding. I'm working on a collection of essays about grieving. I think that in this day and age, it seems that there's so many people who are hurting. We've had so much loss from the pandemic, from all the things going on in our society, and self-care is just so important. And because I want to dedicate my collection, the next book, to my parents again, in the way of it being essays about losing mom and dad so close together. And also, I'm a breast cancer survivor. My breast cancer occurred while my mother had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. So there was a lot going on at that time. So grieving is a topic I'm looking at, and I'm hoping to have enough essays finished to send to my publisher and perhaps others by the end of the summer.
Now, I'm going to ask you to read something. Since you had the book open, can you just read us a paragraph or so from the book? Hopefully, you
Sure,
have.
Stephanie. Didn't know you want me to do that, but let me see. Let me see what I can do here. Um, let me do
And for
that.
disclosure's sake, yes, Lisa and I went to Hampton together. We just celebrated our 40th year reunion. We were down at the school celebrating, and it's so interesting to see where the directions that people's lives have taken over the years. I think that was the most fun, is just to see this person's doing this person's in Atlanta, or this person's in Boston. So it was fun. It was fun, and I think one of my favorite professors when we were at Hampton, her name was Lottie S. Knight. And I think Lottie Knight is smiling from heaven to see so many of her students have done so well.
Yes,
So if you could.
I'll read, but I want to before you mentioned Lottie Knight, and I have a lot of fun memories about her. One that's distinctive, and you may remember this one, Stephanie. She would pass out your papers after she'd give you a quiz or something. You write something, and then she'd pass out your papers. And the people who didn't do too well in their papers, she'd take it, ball it up, and throw it at them. Do you recall that? She was something else.
Yes, she was. And what the first paper she gave back to me, because I thought I was hot stuff. I thought I was like the best writer ever. It looked like a candy cane. She had so many red marks through the paper. I was so upset. I went to, I stammered to her office and I was like, how did I know this was good? How could you? And she told me it wasn't good. And she was honest with me, but she helped to make it better. She helped to make me better. So anyway, before we run out of time, I got to have you read that passage.
Okay, I'll read a short excerpt, and I'm reading this dry. I didn't rehearse because I didn't know we were going to do this. That's okay. It's about Omar Bosari and his wife Natalie, and they're facing challenges in their marriage. Across the Bellport River in Petite Africa, Omar Bosari read the note that his wife Natalie held inches from his nose. The Bosaris had to pay 3 months back rent by the end of the month, including late fees, or be evicted. "Ella's an idiot," Omar muttered as he returned his attention to the peanut paste he had cooking on the stove. "Fullerton does not care a fig about us." Natalie flung the notice, along with the rest of the day's mail and her canvas book bag, onto the kitchen counter. An accounting textbook, the Bellport Gazette, and some sheet music slid out. She tugged at the sleeves of her goose-down jacket and hung it on a hook in the hallway. "I knew a rent strike was a bad idea," she fumed. "Why did you listen to those people?" The Bosaris rented a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the Commonwealth Arms, a pre-World War I building on King Street in the heart of Petite Africa, owned by white businessman James Fullerton. They'd moved there 6 months ago when a fire burned down their 3-story rooming house on the corner of Pleasant and Garfield Avenues, 5 blocks away. Omar's uncle Mustafa had found them their first apartment a year and a half ago when the couple moved to town after they both dropped out of Howard University in Washington, D.C. After the fire, Mustafa stepped in again, negotiating a reduced price from Fullerton for the couple to live at the Commonwealth Arms. This allowed Omar to cover most of the household expenses with the $30 to $40 a week he averaged from his drumming performances. Natalie was studying to be an accountant, but dreamed of theater and film. She had white classmates at Bellport College who got experience and a little extra money doing bit parts in TV commercials. But casting companies rarely chose Black performers, so she settled for jobs doing voiceovers and singing jingles for radio. She barely had enough money to pay for her college courses and private voice and acting lessons. Not much was left over for anything else. So I'll stop there.
Very good. We've been talking to Lisa Braxton. She's author of the book, The Talking Drum. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Lisa. And we'll give your information at the end of the program. You've been watching the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Have a great day.